Welcome. My name is Georgia and I am publishing manager at the Emma Press. This is how our hour together will run. I will give you a very brief introduction to the press before I introduce Andrea officially and ask her to tell us more about her beautiful collection, Eggenwise and Other Poems, published 19th of October 2023, and released today in ebook format, which you can buy from our website, and I'll pop the link into the chat later. So we will hear some poems and a little bit about the inspiration behind this book. And at the end, I will open up to questions from you. So if there's anything you'd like to ask Andrea, or if you have any questions for the press, please do share them in the chat as they come to you. Just write them down and we will collect them at the end, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. The Emma Press is a small press with big dreams, founded by the multi-talented Emma Diane Wright in 2012. So we're 11 years old now. We are based in Birmingham and we publish poetry and prose for adults and children. We are open to submissions twice a year, which is how Eggenwise came to us. And I'm delighted that Andrea is here with me today to celebrate its launch. Andrea Davidson is a writer from Toronto, Canada, who now lives in Leuven, a ring-shaped city in Belgium. She has a PhD in literary studies from the University of Antwerp, where she is a researcher and also teaches. And Eggenwise and Other Poems is her first book. Eggenwise is a warm, conversational kind of verse letter, it feels like, in which Andrea invites you to step into her new home in Belgium and to really savour the sounds of the language she's learning, and to stop and think about the remarkable sensory things of the everyday. And after reading this collection, which really does feel like it's a letter from a dear friend or a sister, I'm really excited to hear a bit more about it. Andrea, I would like to start by asking you write regularly in your day job, researching and teaching literature. So how did you come to writing poetry? And for you, how are these two, so creative writing and critical writing, related?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Georgia, and the question. Wow. I do write as often as I can. And there's always a bit of a fight when I write between whether I'm going to be explaining something very clearly, as succinctly as possible for an academic reader, or if I'm going to be a bit more creative and tell the story my way. I've actually been writing poetry for much longer than Eggenwise has been out in the world. And I guess my writing grew from the same impulse that got me all the way through doing a PhD, which was always wondering, how do you make books, poems, texts, stories? What are the parts? How do those parts work together? And I researched that in my PhD by looking at how another author made all the parts fit together in the novels that he wrote. He's a British author named Aidan Chambers. Anyone familiar with British children's literature will know his name. And I was lucky enough to go and look at the archive that he collected over the years of all the draft versions of his novels and the letters he exchanged with people while he was writing them, and the notebooks where he wrote down his ideas. And in my research, I pieced together the story of how his novels became novels. And in the background, when I was too tired or too in need of a break to work on that project, I started writing my own collection of poems, which became Eggenwise. And I think I was asking some of the same questions while writing this as I was asking in my research on Aidan Chambers. Like, how do you write a book? To start. And I guess the form of a poetry collection came to me sort of naturally, because it's a test in finding the right order and seeing what's missing and adding it. And I guess I can't change it anymore, because now the book is here out in the world.
It's too late. It's too late to make changes. Thank you, Andrea. So from that kind of very technical point of thinking about craft and very observational point, Eggenwise, actually, I'll ask you that a little bit later. Just thinking about how you were writing this as much as kind of a way of processing what you were researching then. I would like to know that if you had a specific reader in mind. So for those of you that don't know the press, Eggenwise is one of 3 publications selected from out of 226 submissions, and it was the only children's, maybe another question, but only collection that was for children that we selected out of that round. When you wrote Eggenwise, yes, when you wrote it, so before you submitted to us, did you have a reader in mind? Were you writing for a specific person or target audience?
I was purposefully not, which is why actually I laughed when the Emma Press suggested that this should be a young adult or a children's book. I was actually trying to write something that anybody could read. And okay, but I should reel it back a little bit first, because some of the poems in Eggenwise are older than the idea of putting the poems into the order of Eggenwise. I wrote some of them much longer ago. Then I started writing the first poem. And with that, you'll see in a second, the first poem is very playful. It's comes across as a children's poem, I guess. But when I was writing it and the other ones, when I started to realize, there's a book in here, I was really testing something out. I was really thinking, from my other job as a researcher of children's literature, I was thinking about the questions that scholars of children's literature are often asking, like, who is the child reader? Or what does that author think a child reader is able to do, or needs to read, or wants to enjoy? And here at the University of Antwerp, I am lucky to have a lot of colleagues who are working on children's literature, and together we were really piecing together the question of how is childhood constructed or thought about or assumed to be in children's literature, and also how are other ages constructed or assumed to be or imagined as readers when you have a work of children's literature. And the question I started to think about right before the fly buzzed in and I started to write that poem that begins Eggenwise, the question was, is it possible to write something that a reader of any age would be able to enjoy? And maybe surprisingly, or maybe not, it seems like some people are really in doubt that could be. So I wanted to try it. And that was Eggenwise, and I was quite satisfied with it. I thought, yeah, well, I enjoyed writing it, so someone of my age would possibly enjoy reading it. But also some of the younger people I know would enjoy it, and the older people I could imagine maybe would also enjoy it. And then I sent it to the Emma Press, and Emma wrote back to me and she asked me who I thought the reader was, and I gave some version of this answer, and she said, oh, so it's YA, which is, of course, children's literature, but for a slightly older audience, which is perfect because young adult literature, in fact, is known to be read by people of all ages. Whether my idea of the reader has changed since then, I don't know. I guess it might still change now that Eggenwise has been out in the world for a week and people have started reading it.
I think locally we can, from speaking from Birmingham, we can definitely say that it's changed and that you've had readers as young as 5 inspired to write poems about flies. I think now would be a really good time if you're happy to give us a bit of a sneak preview and share a few of the poems from the book and maybe tell us a little bit about the story of how they came to be.
For sure. I'll start at the beginning. But first, in case anyone hasn't seen it, I'll give a view of that beautiful cover by Amy Louise Evans. And when I remember to, I'll turn the book over so you can see some of the illustrations that go with the poems. Number 1, no pets allowed in my apartment block, but I have this fly who flew in one day, who is still buzzing. And when I read this in Birmingham to a group of very energetic kids, I went with my pet fly. It just never left. I thought that these guys, flies, had 24-hour lifespans, but my fly must be immortal or undead. It awakened me today with a buzz in my ear. Sweet nothing. 25 minutes before my alarm clock was going to beep. So thanks to this fly, I lost some of my beauty sleep. Otherwise, my fly is not a bad pet. It is low maintenance, self-sustaining, doesn't need too much space, only sometimes a pain in the eardrum. I don't have to scoop its poop, for example. I don't know what it eats, and I don't want to know, really. I think I can get away with keeping my fly, even though no pets are allowed here, as long as it promises to stop waking me up, especially on weekends. 2. Hello. I wanted to tell you about myself because it gets lonely for me here during the day without having someone to talk aloud to, and I hoped that you might find me interesting. I would also like to learn about you. One day you can write your own story and I will try to find it and read it, even though stories sometimes slip away. I'm a writer. As well as writing this book, I have a job writing about another writer, his books, and most of all, how he wrote them. It is difficult writing books, so according to me, it is a good idea to learn about how other people write. Just like that. My writer is trying to write another book right now. Sometimes he gives up on that and he just writes me an email instead. How's your work coming along? I ask him. It is not coming along, he replies. How is yours? If he emails me today and asks me that question, I would have to say, to be honest with him, I'm writing a poem today. I will try to write about you again tomorrow. Did you realize that writing is so difficult? It gets even harder when you have a lot of stuff to think about and a pet fly who always buzzes around your ankles. It is the hardest when you are trying to begin. Of the illustrations there. Of course, the author in that poem is Aidan Chambers, and I guess I was writing that while I was procrastinating, as that's what that poem is about. It was such a wonderful but sort of intense experience to research another author who was right there emailing me every so often, and also who was still alive and interested, very interested in what I would find about him. It was intense and it was wonderful. And now I realize on the other end of all that research and the writing together that we did, having my own poem come out of it is quite wonderful. Some more. Number 3, more about me. I live in Belgium, in a region called Vlaams-Brabant. That is why the rule in my apartment block that says no pets allowed actually says, I'll hold it up to you. It might be backwards, actually, I'm not sure. That does not mean House Diaries Night Toe Gelato. Try saying it like this. Haast hierin niet toegelaten. Unless you already speak Dutch. Then you know how to pronounce this and how to open up your throat like there is a whole tangerine in there to say the ah of Vlaams. There's The Tangerine by Amy Louise Evans. I'll tell the story of this poem too. Oh yeah, do try saying it if you can. Haast dir niets toegelaten. I was learning Dutch just from a few months before I moved to Belgium, and since I moved here, I continued learning it. And one of my favorite things about learning Dutch was learning how to move my mouth so that I could make all the noises and sounds that you have to make so that people will understand you and not reply to you in English. And opening up the back of your throat is one of the most difficult things for an English speaker to be able to do, to say that ah sound. And I have to give credit to the image of the tangerine in this poem. It doesn't come from me originally. I have choral training. I've sung in choirs throughout my life, and one of my very first choral directors and a music teacher in my secondary school taught us this image that when we had to sing a high note, we had to imagine a tangerine at the back of the throat. And to Miss Newsom's credit, it always stuck with me, and it helped me learn how to speak Dutch as well, unexpectedly. Here's the rest of that poem. Haast dir niet toegelaten. If this rule did not exist, then I would like to have a cat who would sleep on my feet while I try to write about my friend, the writer, and while I write right now to you. I do have a cat who visits every single day by velveting her way through the garden that grows beneath my kitchen balcony. She actually belongs to a neighbor who does not live in my building. Number 3.5. I also have a cat who lives with my parents and my sisters. They live in Canada. I would like to go visit them again, but it is the coronavirus pandemic, so I do not want to take an airplane. This is my favorite page for the illustrations. The way that this cat, actually the two cats of these poems have been captured here in Amy's pictures is wonderful. Number 4. Living here in Belgium, I have learned how to speak Dutch and how to understand it pretty much when other people speak really fast or with an accent from Genk or Ghent, but no place farther west than I can't. Or in a dialect, which is like a secret language for people who grew up in the same village. There's a streetscape, I think Leuven. Actually, I don't understand a lot of dialect. Dialect is when language becomes a secret code. I have learned some words in the dialect of my boyfriend's village. Oh, I forgot to tell you that I have a boyfriend. Yes, sirree, he's the reason I live in Belgium. He's very tall and very funny and sometimes too shy to be funny, but he's very good at making people laugh, including me, and he has curly brown hair, sometimes a beard and always friendly eyes. And he also got woken up this morning by our fly. Bzzz. I also want to read a poem that I have to dedicate to somebody who's here listening. This poem, number 6, is called Inge's Chocolate Tour. So thank you for coming, Inge. By the way, if you travel to Belgium, or even if you live here, you should take Inge's Brussels Chocolate Tour. You can do Inge's Chocolate Tour either all in one go or in between some Brussels sightseeing, like visiting Zinneke, Janneke, and Mollekepis. That's Zinnekepis. Her tour goes like this. You arrive at the station, Bruxelles Centraal. Then walk to Grand Place via an arcade of delectation called Galerie Royale Saint-Hubert. Stop in everywhere, at every chocolate shop and biscuiterie. More six. Pralinicas. Pralinicas are the bite-sized Belgian specialty that you must try. You can stop inside the shops to buy one praline at a time, or buy a box of 4 or 9 of them for yourself or for your friend. Squares of deliciousness, circles of truly scrumptiousness, or starbursts of surprise because you have to find out what's inside. Eat pralinicas in 2 small bites. Melt them in your mouth. Eat them before they melt in your fingers. There they are. And there they are again on the cover. I actually have another poem about Inge. Number 7 is called Inge. Let me tell you more about Inge, my friend who also lives in Belgium, who has 2 cats and a beloved. Like me and my boyfriend, she loves this restaurant called Gloria. You have to say it with a breathy. So she took him here to introduce us all to each other on a double date at Gloria, where the parsley sprigs are perfectly salted so they gleam and crackle with roasting. Casse croquettes comes perfectly garnished with parsley. Inge introduces us to the man she's fallen in love with. He calls her Schat. Schat. Number 8. This cute word sounds a bit like ghazal, which is Arabic and means a love poem. You know that noise you make when you stick out your tongue and gargle? To say schat and ghazal, do it softly as you can, so the hard consonants come out whispery. Blow them like a kiss. Love is music that flows up from your heart to your lips, thanks to our diaphragms and languages. This next poem, I've heard from certain readers, all of whom come from Antwerp, so they are Antwerpenaren, that this one is their favorite, and it won't surprise you why. Number 9, train stations. Antwerp-Berchem and Antwerp Centraal are train stations in Belgium. It takes about 5 minutes to go between them by train. Berchem, say it like ghazal, is nothing special, unless you have to get off there. Centraal is iets anders altogether. That means something unique. A place where lovers should meet after a long separation and kiss, and where children should gaze into every cranny of the place looking for details, locking their eyes on the curve of an arc, and use the huge moon-like clock to practice telling the time of day. And that is the train station on Antwerp Centraal, where I'll be going right after this. Number 10, Tussenstation. After eating at Gloria, the next day at Antwerp-Berchem, outside the station, the musician who's missing his front teeth plays his trekzak faster when my €2 clatter in his cab. 2 cents, station, a way station, a stop in between, an interlude. This might be my second favorite page. I think the illustrations are really wonderful. Although this next page isn't bad either. There we go. That's a sneak peek of Eggenwise.
Thanks so much, Andrea. So I never tire of hearing an author read their poems out loud. It's such a different experience to reading them. As warm and as conversational as it feels, it's totally different feeling to hear them read out by you. So thank you. You mentioned a few times the illustrations then by Amy Louise Evans. And I just think this, you know, you submitted a whole collection, and now you have an illustrated book, and I'm curious to know a little bit about how you feel about that. But how could you tell us a little bit about that process and how it worked, and also if it's changed how you see the poems or the collection as a whole?
I didn't know it would be illustrated when it was first accepted. I was satisfied enough with the acceptance, but then when I heard that it was going to be a children's book with illustrations, I thought, wow, I didn't know they were missing. But they really complete the poems, and it was so amazing and surprising to see Amy's drawings as she started to send them to me, because she noticed things, first of all, that I didn't. Like the imagery of the tangerine on this poem, she decided that the illustration wouldn't be a sign or a pet or anything else. It was going to be that big tangerine, and it really is big. It's almost the size of my fist, and it makes you realize something else you can think about with the poem. It really goes so nicely and fills the page like this, the cats. The most surprising thing about the illustrations, though, was that Amy did not shy away from making characters come alive through the pictures for this book. And I have a lot in common with the speaker of this book, and I became one of the illustrated characters, which was really funny. So there are also pictures of someone who looks a bit like me, resembles my author photo a tiny bit, although I don't have a desk like that, but it would be nice to have one that big. Yeah, it was a lovely process to work with Amy, even though it was all done from a distance. We never had a face-to-face conversation, but I think the way that she illustrated these poems, she really connected with me in another way. And I'm really happy with them.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. It reminded me, because obviously I haven't really had a chance to chat with you about the illustrations. For those of you drawing, I was on leave. I was part of we wanted this book when I first joined the press, and then I was on leave, so I kind of came back to this amazing fully fledged book, so I didn't see the whole process of the illustrations. And you just reminded me then of how you said, oh, I didn't think it needed completing. I agree, I don't think it needed completing. I think the illustrations add something different, like kind of like a parallel interpretation. And recently author Craig Green did a blog for us about the presentation of We're Going on a Bear Hunt, if there's any fans of younger children's literature, and about how when Helen Oxenbury presented the illustrations to Michael Rosen, apparently he was like, this is very nice, but this is not at all the book. And now they kind of come as part and parcel of it, and you couldn't imagine them any other way. But I think it's so interesting in terms of process for a writer to see something that even if you're making pictures with text, for someone else to then come up with very different pictures. Going a little bit back to your readings, and I was going to try and attempt to cite some of the words, but I'm just terrified that I'm going to be absolutely massacring that. I love how you describe dialect as a secret code and how you celebrate dialect. And one thing that when I was in that first submissions meeting with Emma and Pema, and we all loved this collection, one thing that really struck us about it was that play of sounds across languages. So this is a question about the book, but also a question more generally, that I'd like to know a little bit how, for you, as a writer, but also as a person learning another language has kind of informed your understanding of English and made you look back at English as well as your writing more generally?
It's a question with so many answers. I'm actually going to start by not answering your question exactly, but
Fine.
I am Canadian and I speak Canadian English. So working with the Emma Press in the UK to put these poems together, and then having the chance to travel there a couple of weeks ago to do some readings and workshops, I was actually confronted with the third language of Eggenwise, which is the other English. I've written about the Dutch language, specifically Flemish Dutch, because that's the Dutch that's spoken in Flanders and Belgium. But our Englishes are different enough as well. And it was something that I was attentive to already before I even thought about incorporating another language into my poetry, that depending on who's reading or writing, I guess, a poem written in English can sound very different, depending on where in the world it comes from. So I was already attuned to this. I had written a poem once long ago, and I rhymed two words that to me rhyme, grass and mass, for whatever reason. And I gave the poem to my instructor at that point, who was English, and he said, "Well, where's your rhyme scheme? They don't rhyme with each other." And I became interested in the varieties of Englishes and also the different possibilities that opens. Like you are writing in different languages at different times. So anyway, that's the longer history of Eggenwise, and then I learned Dutch, and then wow, learning another language is a lot of work. You really don't just learn by going to class for a couple hours a week. You learn through practicing and listening and reading, and most of all, I think, wanting to learn. And one of the ways that I tried to catch up on one of the most difficult parts of learning Dutch, which was writing. I mean, writing in general in a language that isn't your own is difficult. But I really wanted to be able to write. And so I started reading poems because I thought, oh yeah, these are short. If I read a poem that was written in Dutch and try to write it in English and then write it back into Dutch, not as a poem, I might get some literary satisfaction out of the exercise. And I did it, but I got more satisfaction out of really thinking about the words that I was learning and how fun they were to say and how complicated they were. And I was inspired by the poetry of the Dutch language, actually. There are some really fun words in Dutch, like one that I got the title of this book from, Eggenwise. Eggenwise. So difficult to say. And depending on which Dutch you speak, just like English, Dutch sounds different depending on where you're from. The word sounds totally different. And as far as I know, no matter where the Dutch speaker is from, Eggenwise is almost impossible to write in English. It just doesn't have the same sounds as the sounds that we use in English. But I tried. I made up Eggenwise. Also, it was so fun to read Eggenwise with that group of young writers in Birmingham. And they started using the word Eggenwise as if it had already passed into English. In Dutch, eigenwijs means something like stubborn or independent or striking out on your own. So I challenge you, English speakers in the audience, use Eggenwise if you like the sound of that and you want to be able to use it in your regular language. But now I've made a few loops and I've almost lost the thread of what I was saying. Yes, it was the poetry of the Dutch language. It was some of the most fun words that I learned were compound nouns that mean something different when they're put together. So it's a word that's made of two nouns, and when you put the two nouns together, saying one after the other with no space in between them, the word takes on a different meaning. A word like, this is one of my favorites, slagboom, which is a parking barrier that goes like this at a parking lot. But in Dutch, it means like boom is tree and slag is like impact, like when it comes down and it touches the post on the other side of the road. It's so evocative for such a banal thing. There are lots of words like that in Dutch. Slagroom is another one. Whipped cream, where the slag this time is the whipping and the room is the cream. Anyway, I had so much fun learning Dutch that once I'd learned something, I guess I wanted to continue having fun with it and started writing poems.
I absolutely love that. So it's like trunk impact, like tree impact. Sorry, that is so evocative. And I think it's really, I think this is why the proposal really spoke to all of us, that you can tell the whole collection really delights in that just excitement and discovery of sounds and meanings that run across languages and change, and things that you wouldn't perhaps notice unless you'd been in the position of having to learn a language from scratch and really think about how it's constructed and when words have come from. And then you're suddenly like, oh, and you know, that works as much as the language that you might think of as your first language as it is the language that you're learning, because then I think you start to think about things in Englishes, as you so rightly said, that you think, oh, hang on, we say that or this. And one of my favorite ones actually from the group that I don't think she actually attended, the group you worked with, Andrea, but looking at words across languages, the Italian word for houses is written in English case. And she said, that's why you say pencil case, because it's a house for pencils. And I was like, oh, yeah. And things like that. And that for those of you that haven't seen inside of Eggenwise, it's just full of these like delightful stories of words that are just kind of really inspire you to pursue, I think, a little bit with language learning. Because as you touched on, Andrew, I think it's so frustrating if you can't express yourself, that to actually think, no, I'm stopping and taking joy in this process of learning and discovery. I think that's why it speaks as much, one of the reasons why it speaks as much to adult readers as it does to younger children, who are perhaps, as you experience for yourself, very much more at home with not knowing a language and thinking, oh, Eggenwise, I know what that can mean, and just running with it. Whereas it's, you kind of, as you grow up, you acquire that, oh, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, or I'm not sure. But this is a celebration of both, and how, oh yeah, I'm not saying it right, but actually I've made up a completely different word if I've not said it this way. Now seems like a really good time to see if anyone has got any questions that they'd like to ask Andrea about the book, about the process of writing it, about seeing it published. I've already seen that Diana has asked a question which I would love to hear more about too. Diana said, these are wonderful poems. Love the fly. Who is the writer you mentioned? So I think she's talking about that first poem you said, an Agent Chambers. Could you tell us a little bit more about him, Andrea?
I certainly can. I've learned so much from him, and for an author who's made such a big impact, he isn't as well known as he should be. So I don't mind plugging him for a second and his books. Aidan Chambers is the author I was writing about in that poem, because he was the author I was researching while I was doing my PhD. And he, how do I begin introducing him? He's an English author, and he's also more than an author. He's lived a very long life, and he's still busy writing. But all the different sides of his life come together to make him a really key figure in the development of children's and young adult literature into a literary form that we really have learned how to value. Historically, it wasn't so valued, and children's literature still has sometimes that stigma of being simplistic or only for children or whatever, even though we know that's not the case. And it was thanks to Aidan Chambers, really, we're starting to change that image, because he was a teacher of literature. He has an approach to teaching literature that really opens up conversations about how do books make us feel, and what does that mean for the way that we think about them and value them. And on top of all that, he's a novelist, and he wrote a series of young adult novels between the years 1970 and 2005, I think. Some very beautiful books, real literary puzzles. I recommend them if you enjoy that kind of thing.
I love how in the book, because you thank him in your acknowledgements, don't you? You mention him, but I think that's a nice literary puzzle as well. But when I because obviously I didn't see the acknowledgements in the book until it was much nearer print stage, so I was like, oh, it's the writer Aiton Chambers. So I like that you've kind of got that that additional literary puzzle in there. Maybe it's a nice way for readers to discover an author. You get that feeling, don't you, when you're child or young adult reader, that I feel like you feel like an author's your own and you've discovered them by yourself, and it's quite a nice way to find books, I think. I've got a question.
Chambers has a word for that.
Oh, really?
A part in a story that doesn't quite fit, that you have to solve the puzzle of. He calls it a telltale gap.
A telltale.
That's where the story is told.
Oh, I think that's very helpful for any writers listening as well, to get us thinking. We've got a question here from Heidi, and she says, if the Emma Press had suggested an adult target audience instead of young adult children, how different do you think the final publication would have been, or what would be the biggest change in the final collection? Oh, thank you, Heidi. That is such a good question.
I think that's a question half for me and half for you, Georgia.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I hope it would still be illustrated, because look at that. I imagine that not being in the world anymore. It's beautiful. I suspect that if Eggenwise would have been picked up as a book for adult readers, the theme of language learning would have been maybe the one that's I don't know. I mean, it's clear, but maybe there would have been a way that they would have been even more clear. There are actually a series of writing prompts at the end of this book. Something I really love about the Emma Press children's books is there are always a couple pages in the back with exercises that you could do if you're, say, a young writer and really inspired and want to read more, and there's nothing more to read, so you have to write it yourself. There are a list of activities that you can do to write more Eggenwise style poems. And maybe if it were for adult readers, there might have been something at the back, like an encouragement to reflect on the languages that the readers know, or the way that they use language in their lives. I hope it would have still been interactive, because I think adult literature could use more of that playful spirit. What do you think, Georgia?
That's such a good question. I can say a little bit about the discussion when we received it. And then, as I say, I then went on leave. So I will love to ask this to Emma and Pema as well. I think what struck us about this proposal was that it wasn't obvious who it was for. And I think what we loved about this, and what I love about our other books, is that it's very specific, when you read it, it's, I keep wanting to say, very specific in a sensory way, which is what spoke to me. But I think particularly with children's literature, sometimes people feel like they need to approach writing differently if they're writing for children. And of course, on one hand, it is a separate craft. There are perhaps topics that you'd have to deal with in a different way if you're aiming at children and you're aiming at adults, or certain things that you might feel you can't use. But I think sometimes what makes a proposal stand out for being excellent is that it takes any reader very seriously, particularly a child reader. So when we were looking at the submissions, we all loved it, and we did have the question of, who is it for? You know, we weren't immediately like, oh, this would be a lovely children's book. And I think the call was related to, we say we have a picture book, The Dog Who Found Sorrow, that we describe as a picture book for all ages. I think that's true of our most recent picture books as well. We're a Circus in Balham and Yuvia's house. So I think that's why we kind of seized upon it as that. I think if you look at the Emma Press catalogue as a whole, even though we do market things as children's books or as adult books, if you're looking at the content of the I'm still talking as if it's a proposal, the manuscript, there is often that question of where to place it. I'm really glad you said about the writing prompts, Andrea, because often they're written by Emma, but this wasn't the case. Andrea suggested the writing prompts, and I think that is something that probably swayed it more to as well. We actually put the back in the end poetry for teens on the book. However, I'm using it with adult language learners, and it's been, as we mentioned before, where children as young as 5. I think sometimes it's often only when you kind of deconstruct writing in some way. So whether it's as Andrea has done from a critical approach, really looked at how a book or a story is built, and that's informed her writing. And I think you really feel that when you read the poems. Or if you're a translator and you're taking apart one book and building it back up again, it's that kind of closeness that you feel to a text that makes you really connect with it. So I love the writing prompts because I think they're a great way to do that sometimes people perhaps are intimidated by the idea of reading poetry, or they might think, oh no, a poetry collection's not for me. And I think the writing prompts at the back are a really nice invitation. So the first writing prompt is asking if you know more than one language and how you might try and write a poem in more than one language. And I think it's a really nice way of encouraging people to experience the pleasure of writing, but also helping them feel closer to the poems, because as you try and write your own poems based on the prompts, you look back at Andrew's poems and think, oh, that's what she did there. That's really clever. So I think that is possibly something that would have been different because we don't have prompts in our adult collections. And so I'm glad. But yes, I would. That's definitely something that I would like to encourage more people. I think poetry isn't for them. Thank you, Heidi, for such a good question. Does anybody else have any questions? Because if not, I have a sneaky one that on behalf of all of the press, that we would like to ask Andrea if she has a favourite children's book or author you'd like to share with us. Is it Aidan Chambers, or is it a particular title, or is it someone else?
Now, I love Aidan Chambers' books, but that's not actually the kind of book that inspired me in my own writing. That was my job. But there is an author who I really want to credit for having inspired me from the very beginning. And that's an author who is maybe little known, but I really encourage you to look him up. Ludwig Bemelmans. He's an American author, but with European roots. And it was said that he spoke English with an accent that nobody could identify. And he wrote actually books for adults and for teens and for children. And his children's books are the most famous. He's written these stories about a little girl named Madeline, and they're written in rhyming couplets. And his rhymes are unlike anything else I've ever read. I actually looked one up before this because I suspected this might be the question you would ask. But just listen. Madeline woke up 2 hours later in a room with flowers. The way that he pulls that line along in a most unexpected way so that the later happens after you pause, and yet there's still a rhyme there. I mean, that's just one example, but I've always been inspired by these books, and I always thought it was the language. But now I've written my own book of poetry about living in another place, just like the Madeline books that are set in Paris, and another book that he wrote that's actually set in Belgium. It's called The Golden Basket. And I'm very grateful to know his books almost off by heart. So thanks for that question.
Oh, for some reason I just presumed that you were going to say Aidan Chambers, so I'm really glad that we wanted to know that now. I've just written in the chat, and by amazing coincidence, Diana says, oddly, I'm reading to the one I love best. So that's a happy coincidence.
Enjoy it.
There's some lovely comments, but I'm just checking I'm not missing any questions. I can see one. Oh, Luke says, happy that you're staying in Belgium is so inspiring for you. Andrea, before we close, could I ask you to share another poem from the book for us?
Sure. I'll read the last poem. Maybe the last two to set the scene. Number 22. In my home, here in Belgium, the windows of this apartment block have panes of silvery aluminum. Haast er niet toegelaten. This building is a bit old. The aluminum is original. At least the windows are double paned. It just started raining. The raindrops on the aluminum are louder than thundering. "23. Dear pet, the fly, this fly, on my shin, on the sofa, curled up together, in the arms of my love, and quiet here, at home and away. Here I am today. Thank you so much for listening while I shared my book.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I think we'll draw it to a close then. Thank everyone for attending. I will just put, I was just going to put the link in the chat to the book. Now, as I've said, I'm really happy that just in time for today, if you'd like to explore it more, we have the print version here, and if you'd like, if you're an ebook reader, we have now the ebook available direct from us. So thank you so much, Andrea, and I hope everyone that's joining us is inspired to not only read the poems but think about the things that you draw our attention to so beautifully, and perhaps even try the writing prompts at the end to write their own poem. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.